My name is Henry, and for most of my professional life, people have described me with the same handful of words. Quiet, reliable, easy to overlook. I'm in my late 30s now, and I've spent more than a decade working in environments where loud personalities usually win the room. Meetings where the fastest talker is assumed to be the smartest one. Offices where confidence is mistaken for competence. I've never been that person. I'm the one who listens longer than I speak. The one who writes things down when others assume they'll remember. The one people tend to underestimate because I don't feel the need to prove myself every 5 minutes. And strangely enough, that combination makes you almost invisible in certain workplaces. Not disliked, not exactly disrespected at first, just quietly taken for granted. For years, I didn't see that as a problem. I believed that if you did your work well, kept your head down, and treated people fairly, things would sort themselves out. That competence would eventually speak for itself. Sometimes it does, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the system around you quietly reshapes your role without ever asking your permission. Sometimes people decide who you are long before they bother to actually understand you. And once that perception settles in, it can become surprisingly powerful. The story I'm about to tell isn't dramatic in the way people usually expect. There are no shouting matches in conference rooms, no revenge fantasies, no sudden heroic speeches. What happened was quieter than that. It started on an ordinary weekday morning while I was sitting at my desk, answering emails, drinking the same mediocre office coffee I had every day. That was the moment my boss told HR that I had quit. The only problem was, I hadn't. I was still sitting there. I discovered the situation when HR emailed me exit paperwork I had never requested. At first, I thought it was a clerical error, something simple, a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with one quick conversation. But the deeper I looked into it, the more I realized something unsettling. This hadn't been an accident. And the strangest part of the whole situation wasn't the accusation itself. It was how calmly everyone around me seemed to accept it. What followed wasn't a battle. It was a slow shift in understanding about how people see you, how systems operate, and what quiet patience can reveal when you give the truth enough time to surface. So before we begin, let me ask you something simple. Have you ever been underestimated so completely that people started making decisions about your life without even thinking to ask you first? Before everything happened, before the email from HR and the strange confusion that followed, I had already been working at the company for almost 6 years. Long enough that people recognized my name in meetings. Long enough that most departments knew I was the person who could solve certain problems quickly. But not long enough, or perhaps not loud enough, for anyone to really understand who I was, at least not beyond the surface. On paper, my job title was Operations Analyst. It sounded technical, and in some ways it was, but the real nature of the role was less glamorous. I spent most of my time reviewing internal processes, fixing broken reporting systems, and quietly smoothing out the kinds of inefficiencies that slow a company down. It wasn't flashy work. Nobody applauds you for correcting a flawed spreadsheet formula that has been quietly distorting quarterly projections for 3 years. But I enjoyed that kind of work. The details mattered to me. I liked seeing the structure behind things, the way a system either held together or didn't. And when something didn't work, I liked figuring out why. In the beginning, people seemed to appreciate that. My managers would send small problems my way. A report that didn't reconcile. A data pipeline that kept failing overnight. A department that couldn't explain why its numbers were drifting month after month. Most of the time, I would fix the issue quietly, document the solution, and move on. No drama, no announcement. Just another solved problem. But over time, something subtle began to change in how people saw me. It wasn't hostility. It wasn't even intentional. It was something quieter than that. I became reliable. And reliability, in certain workplaces, slowly turns into invisibility. When you're the person who always solves things without complaining, people stop noticing the effort behind the solution. The fix simply becomes part of the background, like electricity in a building. Nobody thinks about it until it stops working. My boss at the time, let's call him Mark, was a confident, energetic manager who had joined the company about 2 years after I did. He was good with presentations, good with upper management, and excellent at describing big strategic ideas. In meetings, Mark talked a lot about efficiency, optimization, and forward momentum. Most of the things he talked about were systems I had quietly built or repaired months earlier. And to be fair, I don't think he did it maliciously. At least, not at first. He simply saw the office the way many managers do, through the lens of outcomes rather than origins. If a system worked, it meant the department worked. If the department worked, it meant the manager worked. And somewhere in that logic, the individuals maintaining the machinery became less visible. I didn't correct him. That might sound strange to some people, but confrontation has never been my instinct. I prefer observation. I like understanding how patterns form before deciding whether they matter. So I kept doing what I'd always done, fixing things, documenting processes, watching how decisions traveled through the organization. Most days passed quietly. People greeted me in the hallway. Co-workers asked for help with technical problems. Occasionally, someone would thank me for resolving an issue that had been bothering them for weeks. But in larger meetings, when strategic conversations happened, my role was usually summarized in one sentence. Henry can take care of that. Not Henry designed the system. Not Henry discovered the problem. Just, Henry can handle it, reliable, useful, replaceable. And over time, that simple perception hardened into something more powerful than anyone realized. Because once people decide who you are in an organization, they begin making assumptions about what you would do, even when you never said you would. That assumption would eventually lead to the strangest moment of my professional life. The moment my boss told HR that I had resigned. Without ever speaking to me first. Looking back now, I can see that the situation didn't begin with the email from HR. It began much earlier. Not with one big moment, but with something smaller. Something subtle enough that most people in the room probably forgot it by the end of the meeting. But I didn't. It happened during a quarterly operations review about a year before everything unraveled. Those meetings were usually predictable. Department heads would present updates, leadership would ask a few questions, and the conversation would move quickly from one topic to the next. My role in those meetings was typically quiet. I prepared several of the data reports that leadership used, but I rarely presented them myself. That day, though, one of the numbers on the slide deck had drawn attention. The company's logistics processing time had dropped significantly, almost 20% over the previous quarter. It was one of the few clear improvements in an otherwise stagnant performance report. Naturally, leadership wanted to know why. Mark was standing at the front of the room, clicking through the slides. "Well," he said confidently, gesturing toward the chart. "We streamlined several internal workflows this quarter, reduced redundant approvals, simplified some reporting layers." The executives nodded. One of them asked, "Was that something your team implemented recently?" Mark didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said. "We've been working on it for a while." Technically, that wasn't untrue, but the workflow system he was describing had been something I designed about 8 months earlier. I remembered the late evenings mapping the approval chains, the trial versions, the quiet pilot rollout that nobody really noticed at first. I remembered sitting with 3 different departments to understand why their processing queues kept stalling. It had taken weeks to get right. And when it finally worked, I did what I always did. Documented the system, handed it off, and moved on to the next problem. So when Mark described it in that meeting as something we had been working on, I didn't interrupt him. I just sat there. One of the executives glanced down at the report. "Good work," she said. "That's exactly the kind of operational improvement we need." Mark nodded modestly. "Thanks," he replied. The meeting moved on. Nobody in the room looked back at the line in the slide deck that listed the workflow architecture file, with my name quietly attached in the documentation notes. And that was the moment, the first small moment, when something shifted in my mind. Not anger, more like awareness. I realized something simple about the way the organization worked. Credit didn't necessarily follow effort, it followed visibility. And visibility often followed the person standing at the front of the room. Again, Mark hadn't lied. He hadn't even exaggerated much. He simply allowed a convenient interpretation to exist. And the room accepted it without question. After the meeting, one of my co-workers leaned over as people were packing up their laptops. "Nice improvement on that workflow system," she said quietly. I smiled. "Thanks," I replied. She paused, then added with a small shrug. "Funny how those things get presented sometimes." I didn't respond, because the truth was, I wasn't surprised. In fact, that moment taught me something valuable. In organizations like ours, narratives form very easily. Once someone becomes associated with success, the next success naturally attaches itself to them. And once someone becomes associated with quiet background work, that role tends to stick too. At the time, I told myself it didn't matter. The work was what mattered. The systems were improving. The company was functioning better. But small moments like that have a way of accumulating. Not loudly, just quietly. And over time, those quiet moments shape how people see you. And eventually, how they decide what you must have done. Or in my case, what they believed I must have said. After that meeting, nothing dramatic happened. No confrontation, no sudden tension in the office. If you had walked through our floor that week, everything would have looked completely normal. People still joked near the coffee machine. Slack messages still flew back and forth. Mark still greeted everyone in the morning with the same upbeat energy. And I still did my job. That's the thing about small moments of misattributed credit or quiet dismissal. They rarely explode into something obvious. Instead, they settle into the background of daily work, slowly becoming part of the culture. At first, I told myself it didn't matter. I wasn't the kind of person who needed recognition in meetings. I liked building systems more than presenting them. I liked solving problems more than explaining how clever the solution was. So I kept doing what I'd always done. But once you notice a pattern, it becomes hard to unsee it. A few weeks after that quarterly meeting, another example appeared. This one was smaller. A minor reporting glitch had been confusing the finance department for months. The quarterly projections kept drifting by a few percentage points, and nobody could quite explain why. When the problem reached me, it didn't take long to find the cause. A legacy script was pulling outdated reference values into the reporting pipeline. It had probably been written years earlier, before several system updates. I fixed it in an afternoon, quietly. Then I sent the corrected documentation to the relevant teams and moved on. 2 days later, I walked past Mark's office and overheard him speaking with someone from finance. "Yeah," he was saying, "we finally tracked down that reporting issue. Took some digging." There was a pause. "Glad we got it sorted." Again, technically, he wasn't wrong. His team had solved the issue. I was on his team. But the subtle shift in ownership was happening again. And again, I said nothing. Because by then, I understood something important. The office wasn't intentionally disrespecting me. They had simply accepted a version of reality that was convenient. Mark was the visible leader of the department. I was the quiet analyst who made things work. In most organizations, that arrangement feels natural. The leader speaks. The analyst builds. But over time, that dynamic creates a strange imbalance. Because the more quietly you solve problems, the more people assume those solutions simply appear. Not through effort, not through thought, just naturally, like background noise that keeps the building running. I didn't resent Mark for it. In fact, I often wondered if he even realized it was happening. Confidence has a way of bending perception. When someone speaks with enough certainty, people rarely pause to ask where the underlying work came from. And since I wasn't correcting the narrative, there was no reason for anyone else to question it. So the pattern continued. Months passed. I designed process improvements. Mark presented department successes. Leadership nodded approvingly, and slowly, very slowly, an invisible role formed around me. I was the dependable one, the one who could always take care of things, the one who didn't push for recognition, the one who wouldn't challenge the version of events being presented in the room. At the time, I thought I was simply being professional, avoiding unnecessary conflict, focusing on results instead of ego. But what I didn't realize then was that silence has its own kind of influence. Because when you remain quiet long enough, people begin to assume you will always remain quiet. And once that assumption settles into an organization, it changes the kinds of decisions people feel comfortable making. Even decisions about your own career. Even decisions about whether you've supposedly quit your job. At some point, though I can't say exactly when, it stopped being a pattern and started becoming a role. Not an official role. Nothing is written in a job description. Just an expectation that quietly settled into the department. If something complicated broke, Henry would fix it. If a system needed restructuring, Henry would handle it. If a report didn't make sense, someone would forward it to Henry. And eventually, People stopped asking whether I could take care of something. They simply assumed I would. In the beginning, that kind of trust can feel flattering. It suggests competence, reliability, a reputation for getting things done. But there's a subtle difference between being trusted and being quietly assigned responsibility without acknowledgement. Over time, my work started appearing in conversations before I even knew the conversations had happened. Someone would say in a meeting, "We'll have Henry build that tool," or "Henry can probably automate that process," or "Let's just send it to Henry." And usually, by the time I heard about it, the expectation had already been agreed upon. I didn't protest. Not because I enjoyed being overloaded, but because most of the time, I could solve the problem. And when you're the person who can solve things quickly, the path of least resistance is often to simply solve them. So that's what I did, quietly, consistently. But while my role inside the machinery of the department kept expanding, something else stayed exactly the same: my visibility. In larger meetings, my name was rarely attached to the systems being discussed. Mark still delivered most of the updates to leadership. He still stood at the front of the room explaining how operations were improving. And technically, he was right. Operations were improving. The department was functioning more efficiently, but the underlying work continued to happen somewhere just outside the spotlight. And slowly, people stopped noticing the difference between the work being done and the story being told about the work. One afternoon, a new project manager joined our floor and asked me a question that stayed with me. She had been reviewing the department's internal documentation and noticed that many of the technical frameworks carried my name in the revision history. So she stopped by my desk. "Quick question," she said casually. "Did you build most of these systems?" I shrugged. "Some of them," I replied. She frowned slightly. "That's strange," she said. "In the project briefings, it sounded like Mark designed the operational framework." Her tone wasn't accusatory, just curious. And in that moment, I had a simple choice. I could explain the situation, clarify the history, correct the narrative. But instead, I just gave the same answer I'd been giving for years. "Mark oversees the department," I said calmly. "I just help with the technical side." She nodded, satisfied with the explanation, and thanked me before heading back to her desk. The conversation lasted less than a minute, but it confirmed something I had already begun to understand. In the organization's story, Mark was the architect. I was the technician. Reliable, helpful, quiet. And once a workplace assigns you a role like that, it tends to solidify. Because roles are comfortable. They make the world predictable. People know what to expect from you. And more importantly, what they don't expect from you. That unspoken expectation would eventually lead to the moment that changed everything. The moment someone believed they could make a decision about my employment. Without ever speaking to me first. For a long time, I believed that the situation in the office was simply normal, not perfect, not unfair enough to worry about. Just one of those quiet imbalances that happen in most workplaces. The kind people adapt to without thinking too much about it. But every now and then, a moment arrives that changes how you see the same environment you've been living in for years. For me, that moment didn't happen in a meeting. It didn't happen during a confrontation. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I remember it clearly because nothing about the day seemed important at the time. The office was quiet in that mid-afternoon way when people are deep into their work. The hum of computers, the occasional soft conversation from across the room, the faint smell of reheated lunch still lingering in the air. I was reviewing a system performance report when I overheard Mark speaking near the open hallway just outside my desk area. He was talking with someone from senior management. I wasn't trying to listen. Their voices simply carried through the open space. "Yeah," Mark was saying. His tone relaxed, almost casual. "Henry's great with the technical stuff. Reliable guy." There was a pause. Then he added something that made me stop typing. "He's not really leadership material, though, more of a support role. Quiet type." The conversation continued after that, drifting into other topics. Budgets, project timelines, the usual. But I didn't hear most of it. Because those few words had quietly rearranged something in my mind. Not because they were cruel. In fact, they were said with the same neutral tone someone might use to describe the weather. Matter of fact. Practical. As if he was simply describing an obvious truth. And that was the moment I realized something important. Mark didn't see the situation the way I did. In his mind, The department was working exactly as it should. He was the strategist, the visible leader guiding operations forward, and I was the dependable specialist who supported that vision. A useful role, a stable role, but not a role that ever needed to change. Not a role that anyone would expect to evolve. I sat there for a while after the conversation ended, staring at the same report on my screen without really reading it. I wasn't angry. If anything, I felt clarity. Because once someone shows you how they truly see you, the ambiguity disappears. The strange thing was that Mark wasn't entirely wrong. I was quiet. I preferred solving problems over speaking about them. I had allowed the narrative around my work to drift in a direction that made other people more visible than me. But what he didn't understand was something that quiet people often know very well. Silence doesn't mean absence. Observation is its own form of participation. And while Mark believed the story of the department was simple and settled, I had been watching how things actually worked for years, watching the systems, watching the communication patterns, watching the small assumptions people made when they believed someone wasn't paying attention. That Tuesday afternoon, nothing outwardly changed. I finished my report. I sent a few emails. I left the office at the usual time. But internally, something had shifted. For the first time in years, I stopped assuming the situation would eventually balance itself out. And instead, I began asking a different question. Not, is this fair? But something far more practical. What actually happens if the quiet person in the room stops playing the role everyone expects? After that Tuesday afternoon, I didn't suddenly become a different person. I didn't walk into the office the next day with a plan to prove anyone wrong. I didn't start correcting people in meetings or announcing the systems I had built. From the outside, nothing changed at all. I still arrived early, still reviewed reports, still answered technical questions when people stopped by my desk. But internally, the way I interpreted the office had shifted. Before, my silence had been instinctive. It came from habit, from personality, from the belief that if the work was good enough, recognition would eventually follow on its own. Now, silence became something else, a choice. And once silence becomes intentional, it changes the way you observe the world around you. You start noticing patterns you previously ignored. For example, I began paying closer attention to how information actually moved through the department. Not the official processes, the ones written in documentation, but the informal ones, the quiet conversations in hallways, the Slack messages that happened before decisions were announced publicly. I noticed how often Mark spoke confidently about initiatives that had originated somewhere else, sometimes from another department, sometimes from one of the analysts on our team, sometimes from me. Again, I didn't think of it as deception. It was more like narrative gravity. People with authority tend to become the center of the story, even when they aren't the ones doing the detailed work. And because I had never challenged that dynamic, the pattern had grown comfortable, predictable. But once I started watching more carefully, something else became clear. The department had slowly built an enormous amount of operational infrastructure around systems I had designed. Automated reporting tools, workflow routing scripts, performance monitoring dashboards. All of it is quietly interconnected. None of it is particularly glamorous. But very few people seem to understand how deeply those systems were woven into daily operations. They just worked, like plumbing in a building, invisible until something stopped flowing. And that realization led to another thought I hadn't considered before. Not a hostile thought, just a practical one. If so much of the department's efficiency relied on systems I maintained, what would happen if I simply stopped anticipating every problem before it surfaced? What would happen if I stopped quietly smoothing the friction points before anyone noticed they existed? The answer wasn't dramatic. At first, it was almost nothing. A report took a little longer to reconcile. A department needed clarification about a data feed that usually fixed itself overnight. Small things, the kinds of things most offices encounter every week. But the difference was that this time, I allowed the issues to become visible, not by creating problems, just by not hiding them anymore. And something interesting happened. For the first time in years, people started asking questions about the systems themselves. Why does this workflow depend on that data table? Who maintains the automation script for this report? Where did this process originate? Those questions didn't lead directly to my name, not yet. But they started revealing something the department hadn't fully realized before. The infrastructure beneath their daily work was far more complex than they thought. And complexity has a strange effect on organizations. It makes them curious. And curiosity, over time, leads to discovery. Meanwhile, I remained exactly who everyone believed I was. Quiet, helpful, reliable. Because sometimes the most powerful position in a story is the one nobody thinks to question. And that position was about to become very important. Especially on the day when HR would receive a message stating that I had already left the company, even though I was still sitting at my desk. If you had asked anyone in the office during that period whether something unusual was happening, they probably would have said no. From the outside, the department looked exactly the same as it always had. Mark continued leading meetings, projects continued moving forward, reports continued circulating through the company, and I continued doing my job. What nobody noticed was that my attention had shifted. Not away from the work, but deeper into it. For years, I had treated the systems I built as purely functional tools. If a workflow worked, that was enough. If a report delivered accurate numbers, the job was finished. But once silence became a conscious choice, I started seeing the systems differently. Not just as tools, as records. Every process leaves traces. Every automated workflow has logs. Every system update carries timestamps and authors. In large organizations, those records rarely matter because nobody has time to examine them closely. The systems run quietly in the background and people assume they've always been there. But I knew exactly when most of those systems had been built, because I had built them. So I started organizing things, not secretly, not dramatically, just carefully. I reviewed documentation that had accumulated over the years, technical notes, version histories, and archived process diagrams. Many of them were scattered across internal drives or buried in project folders that nobody had opened in months. I didn't change anything. I simply made sure the information was clear, readable, structured in a way that explained how the department's operational framework had actually evolved. Which workflows were introduced in which year? Which automation tools reduced? Which bottlenecks? Which performance dashboards were responsible for the improvements that leadership liked to discuss in quarterly meetings? It was the same information that had always existed, just easier to understand. At the same time, I began keeping a personal record of my daily work, not because I expected conflict, more because clarity has a way of protecting itself. Whenever I implemented a change to a system, I wrote a brief summary. Date, purpose, outcome. Nothing dramatic, just the kind of documentation most engineers keep anyway. Some days, the notes were short. Optimized query structure for logistics dashboard. Other days, they were longer. Redesigned workflow approval routing to reduce multi-department delays. Over time, those notes formed something interesting. A quiet timeline of how the department's efficiency had actually improved over the past several years. Meanwhile, the office continued moving exactly as it always had. Mark presented updates to leadership. Projects were announced, discussed, and celebrated. And whenever a technical problem surfaced, someone would eventually stop by my desk. "Hey, Henry, could you take a look at this?" And I always did. Because my goal wasn't disruption, it was understanding. Understanding how the system behaved when people assumed the quiet person in the room would simply continue doing what he had always done. But there was another thing happening that nobody noticed. I was paying closer attention to communication patterns. In particular, how decisions were recorded. Large companies rely heavily on written communication, emails, internal tickets, project trackers. Those records become the official memory of the organization, which means they also reveal something else, assumptions, and one assumption kept appearing again and again in internal messages. Whenever someone proposed a new operational improvement, the expectation appeared almost automatically. Henry can probably automate this. Let's have Henry adjust the reporting logic. We'll loop Henry in later. Later. Not now, not during the decision itself. Later, when the system needed to actually work. It wasn't malicious, just convenient. But over time, those patterns created something important. A long history of written evidence shows exactly how the department depended on quiet, technical work that rarely entered the spotlight. Again, I didn't point any of this out. I didn't need to, because the records already existed. They were simply waiting for the right moment to become visible. And that moment would arrive in the most unexpected way. Not through a meeting, not through a project failure, but through a single email that would land in my inbox one ordinary morning. An email from HR, containing exit paperwork I had never requested. The email arrived on a Wednesday morning. Nothing about the start of that day felt unusual. I had come in a little earlier than most people, the way I usually did. The office lights were still warming up, and the floor was quiet except for the cleaning staff finishing their rounds. I had just opened my laptop and started sorting through overnight system alerts when a new message appeared in my inbox. Subject: Exit documentation. Confirmation required. At first, I assumed it had been sent to me by mistake. Our HR occasionally forwarded forms to the wrong distribution list, especially when several employees had similar names. It wasn't uncommon, but when I opened the email, the greeting made my hands pause over the keyboard. Hello, Henry. We've received notice of your resignation effective this week. Please review the attached exit documentation and confirm your final working day. For a few seconds, I just stared at the screen. It felt less like confusion and more like a small gap in reality. The kind where your brain quietly checks whether you misunderstood what you just read, but the message was clear. Attached were 2 documents. Exit confirmation paperwork. Final benefits summary. All of it was prepared as if my departure had already been discussed and approved. I leaned back slightly in my chair, looking around the office. A few co-workers had begun arriving. Someone was chatting near the printers. Another person was filling a mug at the coffee station. Everything looked completely normal, which made the email feel even stranger. I hadn't spoken to HR about leaving. I hadn't submitted a resignation. I hadn't even hinted that I was considering it. So there were only 2 possible explanations. Either HR had made a serious administrative error, or someone had told them I had already resigned. And there was really only one person in a position to do that: Mark. Still, I didn't jump to conclusions. Instead, I replied to the email in the calmest way possible. Hi, I believe there may be a misunderstanding. I have not submitted a resignation and am currently working today as usual. Could you clarify where this information originated? Best, Henry. Then I closed the message and returned to my dashboard alerts. Not because I was ignoring the situation, but because panic rarely reveals useful information. About 20 minutes later, HR responded. Their tone had shifted slightly, polite, but now cautious. Thank you for your message. According to our records, your manager notified us yesterday afternoon that you had chosen to leave the company and requested exit processing. I read that line twice, not with anger, just with a growing sense of clarity, because suddenly, a lot of small patterns from the past few years began fitting together in a new way. The assumptions, the narratives, the quiet decisions are made without consulting the people involved. Somewhere along the line, someone had apparently decided that the quiet analyst who never challenged anything would probably leave quietly too. And rather than confirming it with me directly, they had simply informed HR that it had already happened. The strange thing was that I didn't feel upset, not in the way people usually imagine. What I felt was something closer to recognition, because in that moment, I understood something important. This situation wasn't just about a mistaken resignation. It was about how thoroughly the role assigned to me had shaped other people's expectations. They believed they understood who I was: reliable, quiet, unlikely to cause complications, which meant they assumed the story of my departure could be written without needing my participation. But there was something they hadn't realized. Over the past year, I had been quietly organizing the records of how our department actually worked, the systems, the documentation, the timelines. Not because I expected conflict, but clarity has a way of revealing itself when circumstances demand it. And now, for the first time, circumstances were doing exactly that. I glanced again at the HR email on my screen, then I opened the folder where I had been keeping my documentation notes. For several seconds, I simply reviewed the timeline. Years of system development, process improvements, automation frameworks, all clearly recorded. The realization wasn't dramatic. It was calm, almost quiet. Because in that moment, I understood something that nobody else in the office seemed to realize yet. This situation had already created leverage, not aggressive leverage, not confrontational leverage, just the simple power that comes from having the complete and accurate record of events. And the most interesting part was this: no one else knew that record existed. After HR confirmed that the resignation notice had come from my manager, the situation became very simple. Not emotionally simple, but structurally simple. Someone had told HR that I had quit my job without ever asking me if I had, and now there was a record of it. I sat there for a while with the email open, thinking about what the next step should be. There were several options. The most obvious one was the immediate reaction most people would have taken: stand up, walk straight into Mark's office, and demand an explanation. It would have been dramatic. It would also have been satisfying for about 5 minutes. But confrontation has a strange effect in situations like this. It turns the conversation into a conflict about emotions instead of facts. And emotions are easy to dismiss. Facts are harder. So instead of walking down the hallway, I opened a new document and began writing something far simpler. A timeline, not a narrative, just events. The time HR sent the exit paperwork. My reply clarifying that I had not resigned. HR's confirmation that the resignation notice had come from my manager. Then I attached the emails, calmly, methodically. Next, I opened the documentation folder I had been organizing over the past year, the one containing the operational systems I had built, the process frameworks, the automation scripts, the workflow architecture. Again, not as evidence of wrongdoing, just as context. Because something had become clear to me in that moment. The department's operations were far more dependent on quiet technical infrastructure than most people realized. And if HR now believed that I had already left the company, that misunderstanding was about to reveal exactly how much of that infrastructure was connected to my role. Still, the question remained: what did I actually want to happen next? That was the real decision point. I could correct the error quickly and move on. Send a short clarification to Mark, let HR update their records, return everything to normal. But the word normal suddenly felt different. Normal meant continuing the same pattern that had existed for years. Invisible work, assumed contributions. Decisions were made about my role without my participation, and now, apparently, decisions are being made about my employment status as well. For the first time in a long time, I asked myself a direct question. Not about fairness, not about recognition, just about reality. If the organization already believed I had resigned, what would happen if I allowed them to fully understand what that assumption actually meant? Not as a threat, not as a protest, simply as information. Because the truth was, if I truly disappeared from the operational systems tomorrow, the department would eventually notice something unusual. Reports would slow down. Automations would require maintenance. Workflows would start producing small inconsistencies. Nothing catastrophic, just friction. The kind of friction that forces people to ask how things were functioning before. And once those questions began, the answers would be easy to find. All the documentation was already there. All the records already existed. Which meant the decision in front of me wasn't really about revenge or conflict. It was about patience. About allowing a misunderstanding to unfold just long enough for the structure of the system to reveal itself. So I closed the timeline document, saved it, and replied to HR one more time. Thank you for clarifying. I'm currently reviewing the situation internally and will follow up shortly. That was it. No accusations. No urgency. Just acknowledgement. Then I returned to my dashboard and continued working exactly as I had before. Quiet, reliable, invisible. Because sometimes the most powerful move at a decision point is choosing not to rush the outcome. And while the office continued moving through its normal routines that day, something had already begun shifting beneath the surface. The consequences of that mistaken resignation were about to start appearing, even if nobody understood why yet. Once the situation with HHR was clear, I didn't make any dramatic moves. No emergency meetings. No long explanations are sent across the company. In fact, if someone had looked at my calendar that week, it would have appeared completely ordinary. I attended the same check-ins, answered the same technical questions, updated the same systems. But quietly, in the background, I began doing something slightly different. I started separating knowledge from assumption. For years, Much of the department's operational structure had existed in a strange middle ground. The systems themselves were documented, but the deeper logic behind them, the reasoning that made everything work smoothly, mostly lived in my head. Not intentionally, it's just how technical environments evolve. When someone maintains a system for long enough, they accumulate small insights that never fully make it into documentation. Which script must run before another? Which database field looks optional but actually supports 3 other processes? Which automated report needs a manual verification once a month because of a legacy data feed nobody ever replaced? These details rarely matter until the person maintaining them disappears. So over the next few days, I did something that looked like routine housekeeping. I began finalizing documentation, expanding notes that had been half-written for years, clarifying process diagrams, adding comments to scripts, explaining why certain structures existed. Again, nothing secret. All of it is stored in the same shared internal repositories where technical documentation normally lives. Anyone in the department could open those files if they wanted to, but almost nobody ever did, because the systems worked. And when things work, people assume they will continue working indefinitely. At the same time, I reviewed access permissions, not to remove anything, just to make sure that every system had clearly defined ownership records, something that had been a little vague in the past because I had quietly maintained most of them. Now each process had a visible description. Each automation listed its dependencies. Each dashboard referenced its data source. In other words, the infrastructure of the department was now more transparent than it had ever been. Ironically, I was making the organization stronger, not weaker. But transparency has an interesting side effect. Once everything is clearly mapped, people begin to realize how much structure is holding their daily routines together. Meanwhile, the misunderstanding about my resignation continued to exist quietly in HR's system. They had paused the exit paperwork after my response, but the record still reflected that a resignation had been reported. No one from leadership had contacted me yet. No one from HR had asked for clarification beyond my short reply, which told me something subtle. Either Mark hadn't realized that HR had already contacted me, or he assumed the situation would resolve itself without much discussion. In other words, the organization still believed the quiet analyst would handle the situation quietly. And in a sense, they were right. Because I wasn't escalating anything. I wasn't accusing anyone of wrongdoing. I was simply allowing the operational structure of the department to become visible. And structures reveal themselves slowly. For example, 2 days after the HR email, a small question appeared in our team chat. Someone from logistics had posted, "Does anyone know how the nightly reconciliation script works?" It didn't update the dashboard this morning. Normally, I would have already noticed the issue overnight and fixed it before anyone asked. But this time, I simply responded with a link. "Documentation is here," I wrote. "Section 3 explains the script dependencies." A few minutes later, someone replied, "Oh, this is more complex than I thought." I didn't comment, because that realization was exactly the kind of thing that needed to happen organically. Not as an argument, just as discovery. And discoveries like that tend to accumulate. Slowly at first, then all at once. The office still believed everything was normal, but beneath that calm surface, small questions were beginning to appear. Questions about systems, questions about ownership, questions about how certain processes actually worked. And once those questions began spreading, it was only a matter of time before someone asked a much bigger one. A question that would eventually reach Mark. A question that sounded very simple. If Henry already left, who maintains all of this? The first consequences didn't arrive dramatically. They arrived as questions. Quiet ones. The kind that appear in chat threads or quick hallway conversations when something small stops working exactly the way it usually does. 3 days after the HR email, I noticed the first ripple. The logistics dashboard, one of the reporting tools used by 2 different departments, had been updated late. Not by much, maybe an hour or 2, but enough for someone in operations to notice. Normally, I would have corrected the timing issue before anyone even looked at the dashboard. This time, I allowed the system to behave exactly the way the documentation described, which meant someone else had to read it. Around mid-morning, a message appeared in our internal channel. "Hey, quick question. The reconciliation process says it depends on a verification step. Does anyone know who handles that?" A few people reacted with the digital equivalent of a shrug. Eventually, someone tagged Mark. "Is this something Henry normally does?" Mark replied a few minutes later. "Probably. He usually handles that kind of thing." The response wasn't wrong, but it contained an assumption that was quietly becoming fragile. Because according to HR's records, I had already resigned. The next ripple appeared the following afternoon. Finance had a question about a quarterly variance report. One of the automated formulas was producing a number that didn't quite align with their manual calculations. Again, nothing serious, just enough friction to create curiosity. Someone forwarded the issue to Mark. A few minutes later, I saw the ticket appear in the internal task system, assigned to me. I didn't ignore it. I simply followed the documentation process that now existed for every system. I added a note to this ticket. The logic behind this calculation is explained in the system documentation under Data Flow Section 5. 10 minutes later, another message appeared. "Wait, this report connects to 3 different data sources?" Someone else replied. "I thought it was just pulling from the finance database." The conversation kept unfolding like that, small realizations, one after another. Each one reveals a little more about how the department's infrastructure actually functioned. Still, nobody seemed alarmed yet. They were simply discovering something they had never needed to think about before. The quiet complexity behind systems that had always appeared simple. Meanwhile, something else was happening. People were starting to look more closely at the documentation itself. And the documentation contained something that had always been there. Authorship, revision history, notes explaining when certain systems were introduced and why. Names attached to technical frameworks. My name appeared often, not in a dramatic way, just consistently. Workflow routing system, initial design, Henry. Automation script revision, authored by Henry. Operational dashboard architecture, developed by Henry. Individually, those lines didn't mean much. But collectively, they told a story. A story about how many of the department's core processes had actually been built. And once people began noticing those patterns, something interesting started happening in conversations. Instead of asking, "What's wrong with the system?" people began asking something slightly different. "Did Henry design this?" Or sometimes, "Does Henry still maintain this?" That was when the first moment of genuine confusion appeared, because someone eventually responded with a simple question in the team chat. "I thought Henry left." The message sat there for a few seconds. Then someone reacted with a question mark emoji. Another person replied, "Wait, what?" The conversation paused. Nobody seemed quite sure where the idea had come from. But somewhere in the organization, the same misunderstanding that had reached HER was beginning to surface among the people who actually depended on the systems every day. And confusion has a way of traveling quickly, especially when it touches something as fundamental as whether a key member of the team is still there. The consequences had started, not loudly, not chaotically, just with a growing sense that something about the story people had been told didn't quite match the reality unfolding in front of them. And eventually, that mismatch was going to reach the one person who had started it, Mark. By the end of that week, the confusion had reached a level where people could no longer ignore it. Not because anything catastrophic had happened. Nothing had crashed. No systems had failed completely. But the small questions kept multiplying. And the more questions people asked, the more the answers pointed back to the same quiet realization. A large portion of the department's daily operations depended on systems that very few people actually understood. Systems that, according to the documentation everyone was now reading, had been built and maintained by the same person, me. Late Friday morning, I noticed something unusual in the team chat. Mark had asked a question, not in the confident tone he normally used in meetings, but in the slightly cautious language people adopt when they realize they may have misunderstood something. "Quick clarification," he wrote. "Who's currently responsible for maintaining the operations automation scripts?" There was a short pause. Then someone replied, "I thought Henry handled those." Another person added, "Yeah, most of the documentation says Henry designed them." A third message appeared. "Didn't HR say Henry resigned?" That was when the conversation stopped feeling like casual confusion, because Mark responded almost immediately. "Where did you hear that?" No one answered right away. But the silence itself carried meaning. Eventually, someone typed, "I heard it from someone in HR earlier this week. Something about exit paperwork." I watched the chat quietly as the realization spread through the thread. It was subtle, but unmistakable. People were beginning to piece together two facts that didn't align. Fact 1. The systems they depended on were heavily tied to my work. Fact 2. According to HR, I had supposedly left the company. And yet, I was still sitting at my desk, answering tickets, updating documentation, replying calmly whenever someone asked a technical question. The contradiction was impossible to ignore now. A few minutes later, Mark's office door opened. He stepped out into the main workspace and looked around the room briefly. His expression wasn't angry. It was something closer to uncertainty. He spotted me at my desk. For a moment, it looked like he might walk over. Instead, he turned and headed down the hallway toward the HR offices. That was when I knew the situation had finally reached the point where it couldn't quietly resolve itself anymore. Because misunderstandings inside organizations can sometimes be corrected easily if they're addressed early. But this one had already traveled too far. HR had processed a resignation notice. The team had started hearing about it. Documentation had revealed how deeply the department's systems depended on the person who had supposedly resigned. And now the same question was circulating in multiple places at once. Not as an accusation, just as confused. How could someone who had left the company still be sitting at their desk? About 20 minutes later, Mark returned to the floor. This time, he walked directly toward me. I looked up from my screen as he approached. He stopped beside my desk, clearly choosing his words carefully. "Henry," he said quietly, "do you have a minute to talk?" His tone was calm, professional, but underneath it, there was something new. For the first time since he had joined the company, Mark looked like someone who had just discovered that a story he believed was simple had become much more complicated than he expected. And the truth was, by this point, fixing the misunderstanding wasn't the difficult part. The difficult part was something else entirely. Understanding how it had happened in the first place. Because once that question is asked honestly, the answers tend to reveal much more than anyone intended. Mark stood beside my desk for a moment, as if rehearsing the first sentence in his head. "Henry," he said again, a little more carefully this time, "could we talk in my office for a minute?" I nodded and followed him down the short hallway. Inside, he closed the door but didn't sit right away. Instead, he leaned lightly against the edge of his desk, arms crossed. Not defensively, more like someone trying to organize a confusing situation. "I just spoke with HR," he began. "Apparently there's been some kind of misunderstanding about your resignation." I waited. Silence can be uncomfortable in conversations like that, but I've learned that silence also encourages people to explain themselves more clearly. Mark exhaled slowly. "I told them earlier this week that you were planning to move on," he said. "I thought that conversation we had a while back meant you were preparing to leave." That surprised me slightly, because I knew exactly which conversation he was referring to. Several months earlier, during a casual discussion about long-term career paths, I had mentioned that I liked building systems that lasted even when people moved on. Not that I was moving on, just that good infrastructure should survive changes. "I never submitted a resignation," I said calmly. "I know," Mark replied quickly. "HR explained that. That's why I wanted to clear this up." There was no anger in the room, just a quiet awareness that a decision had been made based on an assumption rather than a conversation. Mark glanced toward the window for a second before continuing. "Honestly, I didn't realize how much of the operational framework was tied to your work until this week," he admitted. "People have been digging through the documentation." I nodded slightly. "The documentation has always been there." He gave a small, thoughtful smile at that. "Apparently it has." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Mark straightened up and said something that sounded less like a defense and more like recognition. "I think we both allowed certain assumptions to sit unchallenged for a long time." That was probably the most accurate sentence anyone had spoken about the situation so far. Because the truth was simple. He had assumed I would leave quietly, and I had allowed the organization to believe I was someone who never corrected assumptions. Now those two beliefs had collided. And the result wasn't anger. It was clarity. After that conversation, things in the office didn't explode into drama. There were no tense meetings, no dramatic apologies. Instead, something quieter happened. People started paying attention. Over the following weeks, conversations in the department changed slightly. When operational systems were discussed, Someone would ask where the process came from. When a workflow improvement was proposed, people became more curious about who had designed the existing one, not in a suspicious way. Just more aware. Mark adjusted too. In meetings, he began referencing the technical side of projects more explicitly. Sometimes my name came up, sometimes it didn't. But the difference was that the work itself was no longer treated like something that simply appeared. It had authors, it had structure, and it had history. As for me, I didn't suddenly become louder or more confrontational. That was never really the point. What changed was something internal. For a long time, I believed that professionalism meant staying invisible. If the systems worked well enough, recognition didn't really matter. But the events of that week taught me something different. Visibility isn't about ego, it's about accuracy. If the story of a system ignores the people who built it, eventually the organization starts misunderstanding how that system actually works. And misunderstanding creates fragile decisions. Like telling HR someone has resigned before asking them. Today, when I look back on that moment, the email, the confusion, the quiet realization spreading through the office, I don't feel resentment. If anything, I feel a strange kind of appreciation. Because the situation revealed something I had ignored for years. Being quiet doesn't mean letting the story be written without you. It just means choosing when you speak. And once you understand that, the role people assign to you stops defining who you are. You define it yourself. Looking back now, the strangest part of the entire experience isn't that someone told HR I had quit while I was still sitting at my desk. It's how easily that assumption was accepted. Not because anyone wanted to harm me, not because there was some grand plan behind it, but because organizations, like people, often build simple stories to explain complicated systems. In our case, the story was easy. Mark led the department. I quietly handled the technical work. Over time, that narrative became so comfortable that nobody questioned the details anymore. Not where the systems came from, not who maintained them, and apparently, not even whether the person responsible was still there. Until one email made everyone look closer. And that's really the lesson I took from the whole experience. Quiet people are often underestimated, not because they lack ability, but because they don't compete for attention. But silence doesn't mean absence. Sometimes it means observation. Sometimes it means patience. And sometimes it means understanding the structure of a system well enough to let the truth reveal itself without raising your voice. In the end, nothing dramatic happened. I didn't win an argument. No one lost their job. What changed was simpler than that. The story people told about the work became a little more accurate. And accuracy, in any system, whether it's a company, a project, or even a relationship, is what keeps things from quietly breaking later. So I'll leave you with a question. Have you ever been in a situation where people underestimated your role until the moment they realized how much depended on it?